Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's seminar. The McMaster Seminar on Higher Education, Practice Policy and Public Life is a lecture series presented by the Office of the President with the aim of inspiring critical thought within our university and the broader Hamilton communities. And today's event is the sixth in this year's set of 7 seminars. The next and final seminar of the year is a lecture taking place in April entitled Stories of Transformation in Higher Education, Students, Faculty and Administrators Creating Magic Together. You can find more information about that upcoming lecture as well as videos from previous lectures by visiting the seminar's website. This is highered.mcmaster.ca. Now, today's event is a collaboration with the Spotlight on the Arts Festival, a year-long festival designed to foster relationships and to showcase how the arts connect people and ideas, activate cultural discourse, empower lifelong learning, and integrate multiple disciplines in distinctive modes of inquiry. So a warm thank you to the School of the Arts for their help in bringing today's speaker, Robert Duke, to join us this afternoon. Bob Duke is a professor and head of music and human learning at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is University Distinguished Teaching Professor, Elizabeth Shatter Massey Distinguished Fellow in Teacher Education, and Director of the Center for Music Learning. He also directs the Psychology of Learning program at the Coben Conservatory of Music in Los Angeles. The most recent of MTNA's Francis Clark Keyboard Pedagogy Award, most recent recipient of that award, Dr. Duke has directed national research efforts under the sponsorship of such organizations as the National Piano Foundation and the International Suzuki Institute. His research on human learning and behavior spans multiple disciplines, including motor skill learning, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. A former studio musician and public school music teacher, he has worked closely with children at risk, both in the public schools and through the juvenile justice system. Please join me in welcoming Robert Duke.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. It's so nice of you all to come. Patrick told me this is the largest crowd you've had for this, and I told him I'd try not to blow it. This is a wonderful series, and I want to commend McMaster for initiating something like this to sort of provoke thought, which I hope I will do with all of you today. I want to ask before I start, there are many cables that I could be wearing, but I want to make sure that everyone in the back can hear me without a microphone. Is that okay? Good, great. This instruction is meant for you. So I know this may be a little chaotic, and I'm going to take the risk anyway. If you are sitting next to only people you know, I'd like you to stand up and shift in your row so you're next to someone that you've not yet met. So would all of you stand up and do that right now? Okay, thank you. That didn't take as long as I thought. Now I'm going to give you an assignment to do for just a minute, but before I do that, I'd like to play a short video with some music on it, because I'm a music guy, and I have to acknowledge all my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts, and thank you for initiating all of this, everybody coming up here. For those of you who are interested in the music that I was playing while you were coming into the room today, that was a wonderful composer, singer, bass player named Esperanza Spalding. I often introduce her to crowds who don't know her because one of her great contributions to music is several years ago she beat out Justin Bieber for Best New Artist at the Grammys, so I thought she deserves a shout out from... I walk into many classrooms or watch video recordings of many classrooms, not just in music, in the sciences, in the humanities, and I see students doing things that bear only a faint resemblance to what the discipline is actually for. There's really not a focus on what the thing that we're studying is really about. And I'll talk more about that as we go along today, but I just want to say that these kinds of experiences, the experiences that start with a clear focus about what is this for? Now, when I say what is this for, I don't mean how do you make money with it? Because I often have students ask me, or have my colleagues tell me that a student asks them, when am I ever going to use this? Well, that's a terrible rationale for studying anything in college. And often when I have a student tell me, I'm learning this thing, when am I ever going to use that? I often ask students, did you go to a movie last week? And often they say, well, yeah, I did. I think, well, when are you ever going to use that? Right? I mean, you go to a movie because there's something interesting about it, or enlightening about it, or at least entertaining about it, right? But when we think about how we plan things in higher education, and in primary and secondary education as well, I think a question that isn't asked often enough or thought about clearly and deeply enough is, what is the thing that we're trying to accomplish with the people with whom we work? Whether they're young children, adults, people in business who are training employees, whatever it happens to be, what is the thing that we're actually trying to bring about in the way that people think? I mean, everyone knows, if you look at curricula in higher education, or even in high school, secondary school, primary school, almost all the courses are named by the content of the course. So this course is about genetics. This course is about biological sciences. This course is about the history of music from 1750 to the present day, whatever the thing happens to be. But of course, the goal is much more than just conveying to learners information about the content that the course title describes. I mean, what we're trying to do at Texas now, and what I'm also trying to do at Coburn, is acknowledge the fact that what education is for is shaping thinking, is teaching people to think effectively and reason effectively and communicate effectively with other human beings, right? It's not about the content. And everyone in this room who is an expert at anything knows that your expertise is not the fact that you know a lot of stuff. Now, you do know a lot of stuff, but the expertise comes from what you do with the stuff you know, right? It's how you use what you know to accomplish things, to solve problems, to create new things. And that's the real purpose of studying anything, whatever it happens to be. It's not about the content. And again, I'll come to that again in just a few minutes. We're all very fortunate to have this 3 pounds of goo in our heads. And I don't know if anybody can control the lights in this room, but if these front lights could be a little dimmer, I think people probably see the slides a little better. This is a typical human brain. This is not life size, by the way. This is bigger than but what's remarkable about this thing, most complicated machine in the known universe, upwards of 100 billion neurons in a typical human brain. And that doesn't count all the astrocytes and astroglia and all the other support cells that are in a typical human. 100 billion neurons that make upwards of 100 trillion connections with each other. Now, those are unimaginably large numbers. As our brains evolved, we did not evolve to deal with numbers that large. I mean, we evolved to think that there's nothing there, there's something there are a couple things there, there's a lot of stuff there. That's as sophisticated as our intuitive number sense gets. So the idea of 100 billion neurons making 100 trillion connections, not within our scope of being able to think about in an intuitive way. But one thing's remarkable about what brains do is they do 2 things really well. And one is they recognize patterns in environmental stimuli. So as we kind of look around the world right now, we look around the room, we see patterns, right? Our brains are looking for patterns. In fact, our brains are so good at finding patterns, we find patterns even when there are no patterns, right? We can look at a cloud and say, look at that antelope. Well, it's not an antelope, it's a cloud. So why do we see an antelope there? Because our brains are looking for ways to connect that shape into something that we already recognize. And that brings up a second thing that brains do really well, right? Is they form associations between various stimuli and ideas that are already in our head. And those associations, we'd like to think, are always based on logical reasoning. But actually, most of those associations are based primarily on temporal proximity. That is, things that happen near to each other tend to become associated over time. And one of the important things to think about for all of us who are teachers and all of us who are learners, I know there are a lot of students in here too, is how do we optimize the extent to which we connect different ideas that we have in our heads. For a long time, up to the middle of the last century, actually, the prevailing wisdom in psychology, the brain sort of worked like tape recorders. You woke up in the morning, the record button goes on, you experience things, gets written on the tape, right? You go to sleep, pause button goes on. You want to wake up the next day, you want to remember what happened 2 o'clock the day before, you rewind the tape to 2 o'clock, play 2 o'clock, there's 2 o'clock the day before. That's a terrible metaphor for organic brains, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the tape in your head isn't blank. There's stuff already in there. And what your brains are trying to do when you experience something new is figure out how does what's happening right now relate to the stuff that's already in my mind. Whether you're doing that volitionally or just non-consciously, that's happening all the time. So everyone who's in this room right now is experiencing this moment differently from the person sitting next to you. Not just because you're in a different place, and so you have a different visual perspective and a different auditory perspective, but because you have different experiences that you bring to this moment. And those experiences color what's happening right now. Not only that, when all of you leave this room today, what happens to you after this 90 minutes is going to also affect what you remember of right now. So memory is not a static thing. When you're working on your computer, another metaphor that we often use to think about organic memories, and you press the save command, what your computer does, looks for a blank space on the drive, there were blank spaces again, writes what you just saved, which means binary switches flip from 1 to 0, 0 to 1 in some configuration that represents what you just intended to save, puts an address on it, so the next time you go to your computer and you click on that address, it'll go look for that information, it'll read off what you saved the day before, the week before, the month before. And barring some malfunction or disaster to your computer, what you wrote yesterday will be precisely what you wrote before, right? If you click on the icon today, it'll be just what you wrote yesterday or last week or last month. And what's on the drive already when you save the new thing has no effect on the new stuff that you save. And anything you save subsequent to that thing that you saved will have no effect on what you just saved, again, barring some malfunction. Now again, organic brains don't work anything like that. Memory is a tremendously dynamic thing. And we ignore that at our peril. Yet, when you look at most educational experiences that we plan for learners, again, at every level of expertise, we tend to ignore the idea that everyone is walking into the room with a different set of experiences. And because of that, will experience what they're experiencing differently from other people in the room. And all of you who have sat in a class, which some of you probably did today, right, know that the experiences you're having are different from your classmates. Those of you who have taught a class wonder, with some mystery, why that one student seems so fascinated by what you're doing, and that other student seems to be such a miscreant, we can't get him to put the student newspaper down. Now, that may be based on some, inherent flaws or advantages that some people have. But I would argue that much of it has to do with the fact that we teach in a way that presumes that all learners come into the room relatively similarly, and that all of them learn in similar ways and at similar rates, and that when we evaluate them, they'll all learn at the right time, and that when they leave the room, they're going to retain pretty much what we imparted to them, all of which is demonstrably untrue. And I want to talk about that a little bit now in more detail. I mean, obviously, as we're sort of walking around the world and experiencing things that we experience, all that stuff in the natural world has to be encoded in some way that it can be stored in this electrochemical mass of cells, right? So there's some encoding process that has to take place. We hope that what gets in there is going to stay in there over a long period of time. But I invite you to think about the fact that we forget most of what we experience. The current wisdom in psychology suggests that what we consider the psychological present, what I mean by that is like what now is for us, is a window of about 3 seconds in duration. So now lasts about 3 seconds, and now that now becomes then, and there's a new now. And so in a typical waking day, not of an undergraduate, because I know you guys don't sleep, but in a typical waking day, an adult who gets a full night of sleep will experience 20,000 nows, most of which are completely forgotten. And you have to think, that's probably a good thing. As I was walking from my hotel over to campus today, I could not possibly recount the people that I passed or describe most of the buildings that I walked past. I can't even remember the street names right now. Now, part of that has to do with my storage capacity as an aging adult is diminishing, but that's another story. But there's no advantage to my remembering those things, right? So you have to ask the question, as a teacher, as a learner, what would motivate my brain to expend the biological energy to actually form a memory? I tell you what won't do that, what you're doing right now. I promise you, there's a little truth in advertising here. I'm sorry, Patrick, to say this right up front. None of you is going to learn anything from me today, at least not while you're in this room. And the reason is, right now, none of you is busy enough to be learning anything. Now, what's interesting, this is considered a learning environment in many institutions. In fact, at Texas, we have lecture halls just like this, and we're so committed to the idea, we bolt the chairs to the floor. Right? But I have to tell you, this is a lousy learning environment. Right? Because basically, it presumes that the way you're going to learn is by watching what I do and listening to what I say and looking at the stuff that I put up on the screen. What a ridiculous idea. I mean, given the evidence that we have that that's not the case. Right? Now, that brings me to my next thing, which is why I ask you to sit next to somebody that you've not yet met. I'm going to ask you to do a task now for me. So if you have something to write with, would you take out something to write with? And if you're generous and someone's sitting next to you who looks sort of confused, give them something to write with. Okay, I have a brief task for you now. By the way, all of you sharing your materials, thank you very much. I assume all of you who are undergraduates here are majoring in something. And of course, all of your faculty have majored in something and have things that you've committed your lives to. What I'd like you to do is take 3 minutes and write down what you think to be the 3 most interesting and far-reaching ideas in your discipline. The 3 most interesting and far-reaching ideas in your discipline. Right? 3 minutes, and I'll come back and get you in a minute. Now I'd like you to take the most interesting of those 3 ideas and in about 3 minutes explain it to the person sitting next to you. And if you're the person on the listening end of the first part of this conversation, your task is to ask at least 2 penetrating questions of the person who's explaining this to you. Right? And then after about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to switch, and the listener becomes the speaker and the speaker becomes the listener, and the other person has the responsibility of asking a couple of penetrating questions, okay? So I don't have to scream when it's time to stop. When it's time to switch, I'll stand up on the stage, and when it's time to stop, I'll stand up on the stage again. So right now, get to work. Thank you. I want to tell you, what just happened is the best thing will happen this whole talk. And that should happen every day, in every class. And all of you who are explaining your ideas, even ideas that you think you know and understand really well, I would suggest had them modified slightly by having to explain them to somebody else. Not just because you had to say them out loud, not because you had to put them into words, but because another person is looking at you and looking like they're confused, or they get it, or they want more, or stop talking to me, or whatever their expression happens to be. And all of that is influencing how you're interpreting the information that you have in your head. Now, we think that we do this all the time. I mean, those of us in the hallowed halls of academe, we go to meetings and we talk to people and we have these conversations all the time. But actually, this kind of conversational aspect of learning and thinking has to be practiced. Right? I mean, some of you are better at this than others. Some of you thought, I've been sitting in this class now. I've been in this major. I've taken 4 classes in this. I've never tried to explain this to another person before. I've just answered things on a test. Now, why is that? I mean, not because there aren't opportunities, or the opportunities are different, but again, it gets back to the idea that the notion is that I know stuff, you don't know stuff. You're going to come into my class, I'm going to tell you stuff, then you'll know it, then I'll ask you what I told you, and you'll tell it to me to prove that you know it, and then I'll give you an A and we'll all walk out of the room, right? Except that's a terrible model for learning. Because actually, if we have people experience anything new, whatever the discipline happens to be, and what we ask them to do is only the things that we've explicitly shown them how to do, it's possible for people to do something that gives the appearance that they understand when they actually don't understand anything. I mean, all of you who are good students in this room, by whatever your parents or anybody calls a good student, know that one of the hallmarks of being a good student is compliance. Right? Is following instructions and making sure you listen carefully and write down exactly what was said and remember it. Right? But I'd like to suggest that, well, that's certainly not a bad thing, but if you really want to understand something, and if a teacher or a faculty wants you to understand something, then we're never really going to know the extent to which you understand it until we ask you to do things that we've not explicitly shown you how to do. And that's what I want to talk about next. So we talked about encoding, storage, the retrieval part. Of course, all of us have learned lots of stuff that at least we thought we learned, and now we can't recall it at all, right? Because we learned it in a very specific context that had very specific cues, and all those cues are now gone. And one of the best day-to-day examples of this, whenever you see somebody that you know, I mean, you don't know them well, but you know them enough to know their name, and then you encounter them in an environment where you don't usually encounter them. You're in another city and you see somebody, and their name escapes you. Why is that? Because their name is bound to the context in which you experience them most of the times when you experience them. And now the context is different. So now the memory is different. So if you think about what we're doing when we're trying to learn something new, and we're learning to think better or more effectively, or whatever it happens to be, context matters. So how do we create experiences so the retrieval likelihood is increased? And it has to do with what kinds of experiences people have at the time of encoding. Often in the past couple of years, I've been speaking to medical school faculty, and medical schools in the US are some of the best, worst examples of non-interactive learning, right? You go to your virology lecture and you have your big virology book and you read the virology book, or you go to the virology lecture, or worse, you don't go to the virology lecture, you just watch the video online and you memorize all that stuff, so when you take your boards, you pass the virology thing, and we jam all this virology into your head during your virology semester with the thought in mind that when you're in your residency and you're on rounds and a patient presents with a certain combination of symptoms, back in your mind, pull out your virology stuff and bring it together to make some diagnosis of this patient. Brains don't work anything like that. So you have to ask the question, when we're trying to put stuff in, whether it's into our own mind or somebody else's mind, right? How many opportunities are we providing for people to practice getting it out? I'll say it again. Or putting it in, how many opportunities are provided to people practice getting it out? Because we know now, I'm going to show you a beautiful photograph now. In biology, we know about the genome and the biome and the proteome, and now in neuroscience felt like it was getting cheated, so neuroscience now has a connectome, and what this beautiful photograph is neuronal pathways of axons that were recorded with diffusion tensor imaging, which shows how axons connect different parts of the brain to one another, which is a fascinating thing, because all this stuff is operating in different parts of the brain that are highly interconnected. And actually, memories are distributed widely through parts of the brain. Right? A memory doesn't live in one place. Every memory that we have perhaps has a visual component, it has an auditory component, it may have a tactile component, it may have some other connections to some other aspects of experiences or our memories, and all of that distribution needs to be reconnected each time we recall a memory. So retrieving what we know requires as much practice as rehearsing what we know in a very specific way. And the more varied those practice opportunities are, the greater the likelihood that the things that we learn will be advantageously retrievable at some point in the future. I have the privilege of working at one of the largest research universities on the planet Earth. And not only that, we have one hell of a football team. And at least in some years we do. But as you probably know, if you watch NCAA sports on television, all universities have little 10-second snippets of advertising to tout how cool the university is and how much everybody should want to go to school there. And I'm going to show you one that I pulled off the web about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, we don't show it anymore, but you'll appreciate it when I show it to you. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from Texas, but I've been there for a very long time, and I've grown very fond of the place. It has a lovely oddness to it that's really attractive. And I don't want to say anything else about this ad. I'm just going to show you the ad, and we'll talk about why I love Texas after you see this ad.
We don't claim to be able to change the world. We just change people. And then they change the world. We're Texas.
We got steel guitar, Walter Cronkite, got breakfast tacos. It's fantastic. Now, I just love the audacity of that ad. We just change people. They come here, we just change them. And they go out and change the world. Now, when this was playing, whenever I find myself at some social gathering with the then president and then provost, I say, that ad we're playing now about we just change people? How do we know that? And how do we know we're changing them the way we're intending to change them? And of course, the honest answer to both those questions is we don't have any idea, right? We bring into rooms like this and we do stuff at them, and then every once in a while we ask you to do stuff and we let you leave, assuming that we've changed you and you've been changed in some fundamental way, right? All evidence to the contrary sometimes. So, if you're going to change somebody, they got to be a lot busier than you are right now. Right now, listening is seen to be a learning activity. Listening is just listening. If any of you learns anything from my talk today, the learning will start when you're outside of this room, and either you recall something or something comes up in a discussion, and you start to talk about it with somebody else, or you start to think, well, what would I do with a syllabus given what I learned? And you start to change. That's when the learning will start. This isn't the learning part. And typically, because we're well-intended as teachers, what we want to do is set people up so carefully that when they actually start doing something, we've gotten them ready to do it. thinking that the more ready getting we do, the better they'll do it when we actually give them a chance to try. And what I'd like to suggest to you is just the opposite is true. That all the getting ready stuff is missing one important feature of learning, and that is a learner's generating activity from which they gain information from their own behavior. Now, we like to think, and anyone who's raised children thinks this all the time, I want to protect my children from hurt. You know, I don't want them to experience a sad moment in life, right? I want to set them up, and when our daughter was dating, it was the worst period of my life. But through all that time, right, I think if I just set them up carefully enough, nothing will go wrong. And what I want to leave you with today is one of my main points. If nothing goes wrong, it's unlikely you're going to learn anything. That the nature of learning is confronting dissonances between what you either expect to have happen or what you'd like to have happen and the reality that you confront. And resolving those dissonances is what motivates a brain to expend its biological energy to actually form a memory or refine a memory. So learning requires much more doing on the part of the learner, which is not a new idea, except typically the way we characterize learning on the part of a learner is having somebody go away and write a paper or take a test or do a lab experiment or those kinds of things. But if we set people up carefully enough, right, we unfortunately set them up in a way that the student, especially a good student, learns, I'm going to do this without making many mistakes. I mean, any of us who's ever supervised a doctoral student knows the frustration when doctoral students trying to work on their dissertation, looking to us like we already know what's supposed to happen. If we would just tell them, they would just do it, right? And to finally realize, I don't know how to do your dissertation. If I knew how to do it, it wouldn't be worth a dissertation, right? Because then somebody had already figured it out, right? You're trying to figure it out, I'm trying to figure it out. And that lack of direction, many students see as highly frustrating. And why would they not? Because all through school, I am the confusion eliminator. Right? If I see a student who looks confused and they have this look on my face like, oh, look at this. I mean, I'm a nice human being. I want to come unconfuse you. That's my tendency. So let me explain it to you. And think about it. I've explained it to you. Now you're smiling at me and I'm happy because you're happy with me. And now I think you understand this. Except the only problem is you didn't learn anything. Right? Best comment I ever heard from one of my former graduate students, she was teaching a piano class for non-majors that was full of football players. It was just fantastic. And she's this little woman from North Carolina. She was this tall. And so when she was standing next to a piano and one of her students was sitting at the piano, they were at eye level, you know. So she's watching this guy try to work out a fingering to some little naughty passage, you know. And so after a couple minutes of great frustration, she looks at my student and says, you know, if you were a good teacher, you'd show me how to do this. And my student said, yes, I know, but because I'm an excellent teacher, I'm going to wait a few minutes while you figure it out. Now, I thought, that's astute, right? Now, she said that with the informed confidence that actually he could figure it out, right? To just throw people into the weeds and say, good luck, it'll be good for you, that's just mean, right? But the idea that most learners have in school is confusion is something to be avoided, right? And the reason I go to school is to eliminate my confusions. But all of us who work at research institutions know, you know, the government pays us exorbitant salaries to be confused most of the time. Right? I mean, that's why we're doing what we're doing, because it's confusing and I don't know the answer. And that confusion is not something to be avoided. That's how I figure out the answer, is by working through my confusions. But if I, as a teacher, am a person who's actually working through your confusions with you or for you, you have an entirely different experience in the room. Now, if I had 4 hours to talk today instead of just an hour and a half, I would say a lot about how wedded this is to the idea of how we evaluate students' progress in a class. Right? Because being asked to do things that you've not explicitly been shown how to do is understandably daunting, right? Because usually in a class, if you don't understand how to do something, your grade's going down. And instead, to be in a place where it's valued to not quite understand this, but being able to have strategies that allow you to work through it, even if you don't get to the right answer, but you have some things that you know how to do to point you toward the right answer, that's a different kind of assessment, which again, I don't have time to talk about, but we'll get to that in just a minute. This is my favorite phrase I ever made up. I think every learning experience, whether you're a teacher planning a class or an institution planning a curriculum or a degree, should start with that, with a clear, vivid, crystalline image of students as accomplished learners. And by that I mean, when we're finished with students and they're finished with us, what do we want them to be like? Now, I choose my verbs very carefully. I'm not using the lingo of curriculum that says, what do we want them to know and be able to do? What do we want them to be like? Because know and be able to do ignores that there's an attitudinal component to being successful in a discipline. Right? I mean, if I want to be a bench scientist and every time I set up an experiment it doesn't work, I want to start throwing equipment across the room, I'm not going to be a very successful bench scientist because most experiments don't work. Now, for many students, that is a bizarre thing to recognize because when they were in biology lab, they only got credit if the experiment worked. Right? I mean, we have labs all over our campus where students come in, they're freshman biology majors or chemistry majors or whatever, and you do this thing, and if it doesn't come out right, you don't get credit. Now, how is that an experiment? You know, that's like a cake recipe. You know, water didn't turn blue, only half credit for chemistry, right? I mean, that's not why any of us who do research, right? It's because we don't know how it's going to come out. And part of being successful in conducting inquiry like that is having an attitude that allows you to deal with the ambiguity and uncertainty of not necessarily knowing what the right answer is, right? But unfortunately, we inadvertently, but very systematically and often very successfully, teach students that not knowing what the answer is something to escape and avoid at every opportunity. So I just wrote down adjectives that describe my favorite students. I would love rooms full of people like this, but I reject out of hand the notion that babies come from the factory like that, right? I mean, people learn to be attentive, or they don't. And they learn to be meticulous about the way they think, or they don't. And they learn to be thoughtful, not just considerate thoughtful, but thinking thoughtful, or they don't. And the extent to which any individual, any of us in this room, and I'm including all of us in this room, exhibits any of those behaviors varies depending on the environment in which we find ourselves, right? I mean, there's some places we go and we are just really into it and focused and listening hard. And other places, it's really hard to stay awake. So it can't just be something inherent in us, right? There have to be things about the environments that make it easier or harder to demonstrate any of one of those characteristics. And if you made up a list, you'd probably have your own set of characteristics and not mine. But one of the things I want to talk about from the beginning is how do we make this happen in a classroom, right? How do we set this up in such a way that classes facilitate the kinds of thinking and puzzling and muddling that I'm talking about? And you know, when I first went to Texas, I was asked to be on some committee for the state that was trying to plan how they were going to evaluate primary and secondary school teachers in Texas. And I didn't know anything about Texas. I just got to Texas. It'd be a nice way for me to meet people. But it was one of these ridiculous governmental committees that had like 30 people on it. There's no way we're going to get anything done. Just ridiculous, you know. And so we're talking about what to do. And again, I was obviously from out of state. And I said, well, you know, this was like 1985 or 86. I said, you know, there are a bunch of states in the United States who actually kind of tackled this problem before. Maybe we should get their documents and look at them as a starting place for our document in Texas, not forgetting where I just moved. And after I suggested that, there was a long pause, and everybody looked at the floor a lot, and the chair of the committee looked at me and said, other states? Like, you know, why would we consult that? So anyway, I prevailed upon them to allow me to do this, and I looked at all these evaluation systems of evaluating teaching, and what struck me was how alike they all are, which shouldn't have been so surprising. And basically, when teachers are evaluated, probably on the McMaster campus too, that's the stuff that gets evaluated. Now, the language might be different or the configuration, but basically, when you evaluate teaching, that's what you evaluate. Now, of those 6 things that are up there, which thing do you think gets the least attention when teachers are evaluated? What do you think gets the least attention? I won't make you guess out loud, but it's the first one. Right? Now, a lot of people think learning environment, feedback. No, knowledge subject matter. Because somebody says, you have a degree in math? Okay, check. Now let's go look at your learning environment. Now, I want to tell you something, undergraduates, a little truth in advertising here. It's possible to go through a fine institution like McMaster, pass all your classes, even make very good grades, maybe even have gold cords around your regalia when you walk across the stage, and not really understand your subject matter very deeply. Right? Now, that's worth thinking about, not just in terms of your own education, but thinking about what kinds of experiences are required for me to actually know where the gaps are in my own understanding, right? And that's the task in this, is making gaps in your understanding. So what I mean by knowledge of subject matter, first of all, is understanding the discipline from outside your expertise. So I was asking you to talk to one another about things that are interesting and important about your subject matter. Practicing doing that changes the way you think about what's important about your discipline. What always strikes me when I ask audiences like this to write down the 3 most important and far-reaching aspects of their discipline is how many people don't have them at the ready. Because my thought is, what are you thinking about then? Right? Well, I got this little trivial thing that I've been spending time on that's completely disconnected from the main idea. Because everybody who's an expert at everything in this room knows, the more you learn about a discipline, the more you realize that discipline is really based on a very small number of very fundamental ideas. Right? Now, as a novice, you see a new discipline and you see this morass of data. And you think, my God, how can I possibly remember all that stuff? And you watch a really learned person in a discipline give a lecture with no notes and they're calling references out of the air and you think, my God, how could you remember that? I couldn't possibly remember that. And the answer to that is you're right, you couldn't possibly remember that. But it has nothing to do with the inherent limitations of your memory store. The reason that person can remember all that stuff and you seemingly can't is because that person's information is organized in memory entirely different from yours. And that organization is based on very fundamental ideas that permeate the discipline, whatever the discipline happens to be. So if you think about what you're teaching in a class and what you're learning in a class, is everything really focused on the fundamental structure of the subject? And what I mean by the first thing, broad underlying principles are intellectually interesting. I think that speaks for itself, intellectually interesting. And functionally valuable. And by functionally valuable, I don't mean you can make money with it necessarily. I mean you can think with it, right? To know the date that Rousseau died could be an interesting date, or it could be absolutely trivial, depending on what it's connected to. Now, if the only thing I ask you as your teacher is to tell me the date, and that's as far as you can go with it, why would I expect you to think that's at all interesting, right? And often that's what happens when we evaluate learners, right? We don't go all the way to the application of the thing that we're learning, the part that actually makes what you're learning interesting and meaningful. We just go up to the starting point with the idea in mind, let's just get the dates in your memory, and then in a couple years, we'll pull those out, right, and see how they connect to the culture in Europe during that time. Well, you know what? A couple years from now, that's going to be gone. And it's gone because it's disconnected to the other things that are already in your head. Okay. I see some of people in the audience are my age, or younger. But the people who are my age, who are my contemporaries here, you might remember when we were first introduced to desktop computing, and how cool that was, in the late 70s, early 80s, that you could actually have a computer on your desk. I mean, it was just so cool, And I remember getting my first computer. It was in the box. Somebody delivered it to my desk, to my office, and I opened it up. I was so excited, and I pulled out the manual for the thing, which is like that thick, And I turned the manual, and it says setting up your computer, and it says step 1, boot the system. It's in the box, right? Now, what well-intentioned human being would write as step 1, boot the system? Well, I tell you who, somebody for whom booting the system is his first conscious thought when he works on his computer. And of course, the CPU needs to be plugged into the monitor. And of course, the floppy disk goes in with a notch on the right. And of course, it's supposed to be making that sound when you close the little thing, and unless you don't know any of that, right? And then this is just mysterious, right? Now, if you ask yourself the question, right, whatever the subject matter happens to be, what does somebody actually need to know and do to understand what's really important about the subject matter? Often, we think, well, I've got to get them through all this preliminary stuff first, and then we'll get to the interesting stuff. And the person who wrote the boot the system thing probably thought, well, let's just get right to it. Except, I don't know that the floppy disk needs to be in the computer. I don't know that the keyboard plugs in there. I didn't know there's a separate on switch for the monitor, right? So all of those things that I don't know now keep me from having any opportunity to get into what it is I'm trying to do and trying to learn, even though I'm motivated to do that. I have a way to make this all more succinct. If you think about those 6 things, really those 6 things really aren't 6 things. There's only really 4, because the 3 that I have highlighted are actually one thing, or potentially one thing, right? What are the underlying fundamental principles of the discipline? Those should become the goals of instruction, practicing those fundamental underlying principles of discipline. And the only way we'll know whether we've accomplished what we set out to do with learners is by evaluating whether or not they can actually apply those things that we've taught them in ways that we've not explicitly shown them how to do. And all of that starts with the assessment. All that starts by defining a priori, this is how I know somebody will be able to do, this is how I'll know that somebody understands this thing, what I'm teaching them to do, because they will behave this way under these circumstances. I've shown this slide a long time, but it always is a hit. I brought some data from a typical freshman learner at the University of Texas at Austin. Amount learned is on the y-axis. 1 semester of time is going across the x-axis. Yeah, there's midterms, there's final exams. Now there's a lot wrong with that picture, right? Not the least of which is when you're right here and it's 2 o'clock in the morning and the test is at 8 and you're out of coffee and there's just a few no-dose crumbs in the bottom of your jar and you got 2 more chapters to read and you turn the page and it says, for further interest, turn to Appendix D. You don't think, well, let me just take a moment and see what's in. I don't have time for that, right? I got this thing done, right? Now that's part of what's wrong with it. The other thing that's wrong with it is there are such infrequent opportunities to practice using the information in various contexts. Right? So the likelihood of its being retrievable over the long term advantageously is really, 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 really low. Right? Now, if you think about most assessments in higher education, certainly, they tend to be really high in magnitude, really low in frequency. Right? They don't happen very often, and when they happen, they matter a ton. Now, how do you fix that? Well, one thing is you have to flatten out this curve. Right? That there are things that are happening all the time, not any one of which requires, beautiful performance. So you can be messy and muddle and confused in ways that teach you something. Right? One of my favorite phrases that I made up last year, because I was trying to talk to some group about confusion and how good confusion was, but not just confusion of itself, but strategic confusion. I, as your teacher, create strategic confusions for you. Right? That one right there. And I want to tell you, if you want a model, if you're a faculty member, you're thinking, boy, I've never really thought about this before, how can I get a model for that? Go to the App Store, look at the most popular video games on the App Store, and buy one. Right? I mean, I'm 59 years old. I sit on airplanes flipping birds out of a slingshot to kill little green pigs who are trying to steal the birds' eggs. Now, what is wrong with me? That would motivate me to do that. And by the way, I've been doing this for years, Now, why is that? Because, the authors of Angry Birds understand how human beings learn. So what happens at the beginning of Angry Birds, right? There's 1 bird, 1 pig, right? Almost no matter what you do, you could sneeze on the thing, it'll kill the pig, right? Great. But then, now there are more pigs. And then after a while, 1 pig's under a piece of wood. And now there's a different bird that does a different thing. And all of this is strategically introduced in a way that creates challenges for me that are inherently unsolvable immediately. but they're solvable in the relative near term. Now, to make this happen, right, you got to do that. There have to be strategically organized challenges that are not immediately solvable, but solvable in the relative near term. I mean, I don't know what the statistic is in Canada, but in the US, over 50% of the people who finish all their courses and pass their comprehensive exams never finish their dissertations. And why is that? Well, where's the approximation of that? You know, you're doing assignments, blow your mind, you do a 20-page paper here and there, and then somebody says, okay, go discover something, bring something back when you got something to show me. You know, how do I do that? Right? So again, if we really want to set people up in such a way that they're able to apply what they know in ways that are meaningful and manageable and not discouraging, that's something that has to be practiced all along the way. Because again, there's an attitudinal component to developing expertise, right? It's not just knowing stuff, it's do you have the right attitude about that? When you're confused, how do you feel about that? What do you do when you're in a state of confusion, right? How do you adapt to the circumstances that you're confronted with? All those questions that you could say more than I can say. Okay, so now you were watching the Harvard MIT people making fun of them. Now we get to make fun of ourselves. I'd like everyone to solve for x in your head. Don't say anything out loud, just solve this equation for x. I'll give you about 15 seconds, shouldn't take more than that. Okay, you put your hands up a minute. I have to make a little teaching moment here. They're like, what, like 200 people in this room? And like 3 guys raise their hand, and it's like, when did you learn that, in 4th grade? Now, the question I ask all the faculty is, why the hell aren't you raising your hand? And the answer to that is the same reason your students don't raise their hand when you ask a question. Because that was your favorite part of the talk, wasn't it? Now, think about that for a minute, right? Now, I know many of you know how to do this, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is, what if you raise your hand, and I called on you, and you said 3/8? And I said, well, actually, it's not 3/8. You know, then what? Well, then nothing, except if you did raise your hand, and I did call on you, and you did say 3/8, I said, well, actually, it's not 3/8. That would be the defining event of this week. You know, you'd be laying in bed in the dark on Saturday night going, God, why did I raise my hand on Monday, right? Now, that is intensely perverse reaction to that, except it's understandable that you have the reaction because that's what school has taught you, right? When I first started teaching school, in public school, I was naive and enthusiastic and stupid, and I found out that the elementary school next to the high school campus where I was directing an orchestra and a band didn't have enough music teacher hours for the kindergartners and first graders to have music. So again, being stupid and enthusiastic, well, I got a planning period. You know, what am I gonna do with that? So I volunteered 2 days a week to go to the elementary school and teach music to K and 1 kids, right? So the music teacher had a regular classroom, so I had a cart, an audiovisual cart like that one, except it was green, that had a record player on it. You remember records, like really big CDs. And so I rolled this cart around, and it had a guitar on it, and some rhythm instruments, and the kids would see me roll into the room and say, oh, God, it's time for music. Say, what do you want to do? You want to sing? Yeah, let's sing. You want to listen to music? Yeah, Beethoven, yeah, he's good. They were uninhibitedly, undiscriminatingly positive about anything I wanted to do. And I would pose a question and say, I want someone to raise your hand for just a minute. Oh, everybody's hand went up. They didn't know I was going to ask. I don't care, pick me, you know. Now, I've now been teaching long enough that those same children have grown to be young adults. And they've become my stressed, oppressed, grade anxious graduate students. And now I'm sitting around a seminar table. I say, I'd like someone to talk just a minute. Everybody looks at the table. You know, like taking notes like, God, don't call on me. And I'm thinking, what happened to you? What took that bright, open, with it, pick me? I don't know what the hell's going on. Let's try anyway. You know, what happened to you? And the only common variable that I can think ran through all their past experiences is they all went to school. Right? And school took that and turned it into, well, you know, look out, right? And very effectively, very systematically, completely unintentionally, right? I mean, what do we tell people all the time? Be creative, but be sure you get this one right. Well, that's not the way creativity works, right? I mean, okay, anyway, so we're back to this again. So somebody who raised their hand, would you raise your hand again? So I could, would you just tell me the answer? 3/2. 3/2, you reduce that to 1.5, right? And would you tell me your name? Brandon. Brandon, okay. So Brandon says 3/2, which is correct. Now, I'll ask Brandon or anybody else, how'd you get to that from there?
Multiply 3/4 by 2.
And why do you do that?
Because the division you have to...
Yeah, this is the universal symbol for this equation. You do that, right? Okay. So Brandon says correctly that you do that to the thing on the other side, right? And then you multiply, you get 6/4, 3/2, and you reduce, you get 1.5. Okay. So here's my question. I would ask Brandon and everybody else. We already answered. Let me ask somebody else. Why do you do that? Why do you invert the divisor? Yeah, crickets, right? Okay. Now, I would tell you, so you don't feel bad. For the past, 18 years, I give the opening talk on teaching for the faculty at Texas, for the new faculty orientation at Texas. We probably hire, 120 new faculty a year. And I put this slide up. Now, I got 120, people with terminal degrees in the audience. And just somebody raise your hand and tell me what the answer is. And 5 guys raise their hand. They're all in the math department. And I asked them the same thing, right? Now, Brandon says, right, why do you invert the divisor? Well, because that's what you do to do it, right? Now, the best answer I ever got, I was in a room full of 5th graders once, and I wrote this equation on the board, which they all got right. And I said, why do you invert the divisor? And this kid in front row raised his hand and said, because if you don't, you get it wrong. what better rationale does one need than that, right? Now, for all of you mathematically inclined in here, you recognize that the rationale for inverting the divisor is the only interesting thing about that equation, right? Which is unlike the way mathematicians think about numbers, by the way. I mean, this symbol, that doesn't exist in any mathematics books except in school, right? I mean, that's not the way things work in real math, right? Now, the thing to consider is this. If the goal of an institution is to get rooms full of disparate people getting the right answer for that, one way to do it is to put lots of questions just like that with different numbers in them and teach people to go invert and multiply, invert and multiply, invert and multiply, invert and multiply. And you'll get everybody getting the right answer without any requirement that anybody knows what they're doing. And in school, we're really good at that. And students who are good at school are really good at that. Now, I'm not saying that the things are mutually exclusive, that if you can do that, then you must not know what you're doing. I'm just saying it's possible to not know what you're doing, right? And my argument today is it shouldn't be possible to not know what you're doing and still get the right answer, right? But as long as I'm asking you to do things that I've explicitly shown you how to do, and you've been paying attention, and you're motivated to learn, well, why wouldn't you get the right answer, right? But if I change my goal, and my goal is no longer to teach you how to get the right answer, it's teaching you how to be optimally confused, and to use your confusion in a way that causes you to think differently about the thing that you're doing. That's a whole different goal. Now, there's a downside for this for faculty, because as students, you all know, I don't like being confused. And for somebody to say, I'm going to evaluate you by having you come in and I'm going to ask you to do something I haven't shown you how to do, most of the students say, what the hell's wrong with you? This is school. You're supposed to show me how to do it, and then I'll do it, right? So this requires a shift in thinking on everybody's part, right? But that only works if the way we evaluate and the way we give credit isn't based solely on getting the right answer that I've shown you how to get. Okay, and I don't have time for that at all, so we'll go off that. Okay, so I have two thoughts to kind of leave you with before we open the floor for questions, okay? And one is this. As a teacher, you're a learner too. I mean, I'm doing a terrible job of teaching today because I don't know you all well enough to know what's going on in your head. And if I'm going to teach you effectively, I need to know what you're doing, what you're thinking. And so I have to provide opportunities every day that reveal to you and to me gaps in your thinking that might not be visible, right? And you think, well, goodness, you can't do that in a class of 200. Of course you can. We just did it today. Right? Because if you were in my class today, I would take up the things that you wrote, and I would look at them, not to grade. I'd look at them just to get an idea of where people's heads are in the room, right? And I might actually talk to a particular person because I thought they wrote something particularly insightful on the thing I had them write for 5 minutes that day. Or I might find somebody else who's completely in the weeds and go find them as well to unweedify them and try to help them get to a place where they understand this a little bit better, right? But I can't do that if I'm just talking and you're all just sitting there because I don't know enough about what you're doing. So the first central idea, you're a learner too. And then the bigger central idea is learning is error correction. And by error correction, I don't mean students making a mistake and my correcting it. I mean students making mistakes and then working through their own problems, right? So rather than my being the person who solves it for you, or shows you, or who shows you what you did wrong, I'm the person who has sets up experiences where you can be advantageously confused and muddle, because the muddle is where the learning happens, right? We don't typically value muddling. Many students see muddling as a waste of time. And again, they don't see that as a waste of time because they inherently see it as a waste of time. We taught them to see it as a waste of time. Because their thinking, coming into a learning environment, is, I need to get from here to the right answer as quickly and efficiently as I possibly can. And learning is not efficient. Learning is a mess. And all of us know, if we've ever written a book or conducted a good experiment or written a grant that got funded or whatever, we know it's a mess. Right? It's not linear, it's not clean, it's frustrating, it's all those things, right? But the way we teach learners to develop those attitudes has to involve their having approximations of those experiences in the classes that they take all the time. Except that can't happen if we're only evaluating them based on their knowing stuff, right? I mean, many of my colleagues ask questions like, on a test, tell me about your most interesting failure at this. Now, most students would think, how could a failure be interesting? Well, they're really interesting if you actually cook them right? But if failure means the answer was supposed to be that and I wrote that, well, that's not very interesting, right? But if you think, how could I misconstrue the cause of seasons on the Earth as being distance when it really isn't distance, but the angle of light waves striking the atmosphere? Now I've got something interesting to talk about, right? Because now I have a reason for my misconstrual. Because I do know from my own experience that as I move closer to a heat source, I feel more of the heat, right? But doing that with the Earth, with the sun, would be like my now taking 2 steps that way to a heater that's in New Jersey. It's not going to make any difference. But once you understand that, you think about the problem entirely differently. And enough experiences like that get you to think about problems in general entirely differently. And I think any of us who teach have that as an ultimate goal. Right? We'd like people to be in a place where confronting problems is not something that stops you in your tracks, but something that prompts you to think about things that you might not have thought about before. So becoming comfortable with that idea that I don't know the answer, I don't know what to do, and now I've got to try out some things and see what happens is an important feature of every learning experience for every learner at every age, whatever that happens to be. I could go on for days, but I won't, so I'll spare you. And I was asked to leave some time for questions, and I see that we have 14 minutes left, so I will do that. If anybody has to be somewhere else, I won't be offended if you leave before the questioning time. But let me thank McMaster University, the president, all the people who've been involved in my coming here, staff, faculty, everybody, thank you so much, and thank you for your attention today. Thanks a lot.